It started with a crime. Not the kind that makes the evening news, but one so brazen, so absurd, that it left me standing in my own driveway, mouth hanging open, wondering if I'd stepped into some alternate reality. There she was, a complete stranger, plugging her Tesla into my EV charger like she was entitled to it. No knock on the door, no polite request, just pure, unfiltered audacity. I mean, who does that? Who just waltzes onto someone else's property and starts stealing electricity like it's some kind of free buffet? At first, I thought maybe I was seeing things. Maybe my security camera had glitched. But no. There she was, clear as day, dragging her extension cord across my driveway like it was a red carpet rolled out just for her. "Excuse me," I called out as I stepped outside, trying to keep my voice steady despite the sheer absurdity of the situation. "What do you think you're doing?" She turned around slowly, like I was the one inconveniencing her. "Oh," she said casually, waving a hand in the air like she was swatting away a fly. "I'm just charging my car." Just charging her car. On my charger. Without asking. The sheer entitlement of it all left me momentarily speechless. "Well," I finally managed to say, "this is private property. That charger is mine." And do you know what she said? She looked me dead in the eye and said, "Oh, come on. All Tesla chargers are public property." Public property. Is this woman serious? At that moment, I wasn't sure whether to laugh or call the police. But instead of doing either, I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she genuinely didn't understand how EV chargers worked. "Actually," I said calmly, "this isn't a Tesla supercharger station. This is a level 2 charger installed on private property. You know, the kind that comes with permits and inspections and a hefty bill from the electrician." She rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck in the back of her head. "Well," she huffed, "you shouldn't be so selfish. People like me need access to chargers too." "Selfish? Lady, you're trespassing on my property and stealing my electricity." But before I could respond, she yanked her cord out of my charger and stomped off down the driveway, muttering something about how people like me are, what's wrong with America. And here's the kicker. As she drove away in her shiny white Tesla Model Y, she honked her horn like she'd just won some kind of moral victory. Now let me ask you this. Have you ever dealt with someone this entitled? Someone who thinks they can just take whatever they want because they've decided they're special? If you have, or even if you haven't but you've got an opinion, I want to hear about it. Drop your stories or thoughts in the comments below because trust me, this is just the beginning of what turned into an absolutely ridiculous saga. Anyway, back to the story. After Karen, that's what we're calling her now because if anyone embodies the spirit of a Karen, it's this woman. After Karen drove off that night, I thought maybe that would be the end of it. Maybe she'd realize how ridiculous she was being and never come back. But oh no, Karen wasn't done with me yet. The next day, I checked my security footage again, just to make sure everything was fine, and guess what? There she was again. This time, she didn't even bother waiting until nightfall. It was broad daylight. She pulled into my driveway like it was her personal parking spot and plugged in her car as if nothing had happened. At this point, I was fuming. So I stepped outside again and said, "Look, we talked about this yesterday. You can't use my charger without permission." And do you know what she said? She looked at me with this condescending smile and said, "Oh, relax. It's just electricity. Just electricity. Lady, do you walk into people's houses and help yourself to their food because it's just groceries? Do you take their mail because it's just paper? Where does it end?" But here's where things got really interesting. When I told her to leave again, politely but firmly, she didn't apologize or even act embarrassed. No. Instead, she doubled down. "You know," she said with a smirk, "I could report you to the HOA for being so unfriendly." Unfriendly? Are you kidding me? First of all, how am I supposed to be friendly when you're literally stealing from me? Second of all, and here's where things get really rich, I am on good terms with the HOA because unlike Karen over here, I actually follow the rules. So now I'm thinking, what kind of person not only trespasses but also has the nerve to threaten me for calling them out on it? At this point, Karen finally left, but not before giving me one last parting shot. "You'll regret this," she said as she got into her car. "Regret what? Enforcing basic property rights? Standing up for myself against someone who clearly has no respect for boundaries? If anything, Karen should regret messing with someone who spent 30 years designing systems specifically meant to solve problems like hers. But hey, I'll save that part for later. After Karen's little stunt in my driveway, I thought I'd seen the worst of it. But oh no, Karen wasn't just entitled. She was determined. And what she did next took her entitlement to a whole new level. The very next week, I'm sitting at my kitchen table, enjoying a cup of coffee and flipping through the local paper. You know, the kind of quiet morning you savor when you've worked hard your whole life and finally get to enjoy retirement. My phone buzzes with another motion alert from my security camera. Now, after the last incident, I'd started checking these alerts religiously. And thank God I did. I open the app, and there she is, Karen, in broad daylight this time, standing in my driveway with a crowbar. A crowbar. She's trying to pry open my garage door like some two-bit burglar who didn't get the memo about security cameras being invented. I couldn't believe my eyes. This wasn't just entitlement anymore. This was full-blown insanity. Now, let me tell you something about me. I'm not the kind of guy who immediately calls 911 over every little thing. But when someone's standing on your property with a crowbar, you don't exactly invite them in for tea and cookies. So, I called the police and told them what was happening. While waiting for the cops to show up, I decided to step outside and confront her, because apparently Karen needed a refresher course on trespassing laws. "Karen!" I shouted as I stepped out onto the porch. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" She froze for a second, then turned around with this smug look on her face. "Oh, hi," she said, like we were old friends catching up at a barbecue. "I was just, checking something." "Checking something?" I said, pointing at the crowbar in her hand. "What exactly were you checking?" "The structural integrity of my garage door." She rolled her eyes like I was being unreasonable again and said, "Look, Mark, this wouldn't be an issue if you just share your charger like a decent neighbor." "A decent neighbor? Lady, you're standing on my property with a crowbar." At this point, I'm wondering if she's completely lost touch with reality or if she's just doubling down on her entitlement because she thinks she can get away with it. Before I could respond, the police arrived. 2 officers who looked just as baffled as I felt when they saw what was going on. Karen immediately switched gears and started playing the victim. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," she said to the officers, putting on her best damsel in distress act. "This man has been harassing me and refusing to let me charge my car." One of the officers raised an eyebrow and looked at me. "Sir," he said cautiously, "is there any truth to that?" I couldn't help but laugh, because honestly, what else can you do when someone accuses you of harassment while holding a crowbar on your property? "Officer," I said, gesturing toward my security camera mounted above the garage door, "you might want to take a look at the footage before jumping to any conclusions." The officer nodded and asked if he could review the footage. So we went inside while Karen stood in the driveway looking increasingly nervous. Now here's where things get really satisfying. The footage showed everything. Karen walking up to my garage with the crowbar, trying to pry it open, and then turning around like butter wouldn't melt when she saw me coming outside. When the officers came back out after watching the video, their tone had completely changed. "Ma'am," one of them said sternly, "you're under arrest for attempted burglary and trespassing." Karen's face turned beet red as she started sputtering excuses. But, it's just a charger. He's being unreasonable. This isn't fair." "Ma'am," the officer replied calmly but firmly as he cuffed her wrists. "Fair or not, you can't go around damaging other people's property because you don't like their rules." As they led her away to the squad car, Karen shouted over her shoulder at me, "You'll regret this. You'll see." Oh, trust me, I wasn't regretting anything. Now here's where things took an even stranger turn. After Karen was released on bail, because apparently even attempted burglary isn't enough to keep someone locked up these days, she decided to escalate things by filing a complaint with our HOA. Yes, you heard that right. Karen went to our homeowners association and claimed that I was violating community rules by refusing to let her use my charger. According to her twisted logic, EV chargers should be considered a shared resource for all residents, even though mine was installed on private property using my own money. At first glance, her complaint seemed ridiculous enough that I didn't think anyone would take it seriously. But then I remembered one crucial detail. HOAs are notorious for sticking their noses into everyone's business, whether it makes sense or not. Sure enough, a few days later I received an official letter from the HOA requesting a meeting to discuss community concerns regarding equitable access to electric vehicle charging stations. Equitable access? Are we running a socialist experiment now? So I gathered all my documentation, the permits for installing my charger, receipts showing that I paid for everything out of pocket, and headed into that meeting ready for battle. The room was packed with board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else but there. And then there was Karen sitting smugly at one end of the table like she'd already won. When it was my turn to speak, I laid out everything. How Karen had repeatedly trespassed on my property. How she tried and failed to break into my garage. How state laws clearly supported homeowners' rights when it came to private EV chargers. And how allowing her behavior would set a dangerous precedent for everyone in our community. By the time I finished speaking, and maybe throwing in some colorful commentary about entitlement along the way, most of the board members were nodding in agreement, or at least pretending not to side with Karen out of sheer embarrassment. In the end, the HOA ruled in my favor unanimously, not only affirming that my charger was private property, but also fining Karen for violating community rules by attempting unauthorized access multiple times. And let me tell you, watching her storm out of that meeting with steam practically shooting out of her ears, worth every second of hassle leading up to it. So yeah, that's how Karen went from entitled neighbor to full-blown criminal in less than 2 weeks flat. All because she couldn't accept that not everything belongs to her just because she wants it. After Karen's failed attempt to weaponize the HOA against me, you'd think she'd finally back off, right? Wrong. This is Karen we're talking about. She doesn't retreat, she doubles down. And that's when I decided it was time to fight fire with engineering. Now, let me set the stage for you. I'm sitting in my garage, staring at my EV charger like it's some kind of battlefield. Karen had already trespassed multiple times, tried to break into my garage with a crowbar, and made a fool of herself at the HOA meeting. But deep down, I knew she wasn't done. Karen doesn't quit until she gets her way, or until someone teaches her a lesson she won't forget. And that's when it hit me. I'm a retired engineer. I've spent decades designing systems to solve problems just like this one. If Karen wanted to keep testing my patience, fine. I'd give her something to test. So here's what I did. I built a trap. Not the kind that would hurt anyone, of course, but something harmless and just embarrassing enough to make Karen think twice about ever stepping foot on my property again. The idea was simple. I rigged up a fake charging port right next to my real one. It looked identical. Same shape, same size, even the same little LED light that glows when it's charging. But instead of delivering electricity, this one delivered water. That's right. I connected the fake port to my garden hose and installed a pressure sensor inside it. The moment someone plugged in their car, boom, instant cold shower. It was genius, if I do say so myself. Now, before you judge me for being petty, let me ask you this. If someone repeatedly trespassed on your property and ignored every polite attempt to get them to stop, wouldn't you do something similar? Besides, it wasn't like I was hurting anyone. It was just water and a little bit of humiliation. Anyway, once the trap was set, all I had to do was wait. And sure enough, Karen didn't disappoint. It was late one night, around 11 p.m., when my security camera picked up movement in the driveway. I opened the app on my phone and there she was, Karen in her Tesla Model Y, creeping into my driveway like some kind of EV ninja. She got out of her car with that same smug look she always had and walked straight over to the charger. Now here's where things get good. She didn't even hesitate. Didn't check to see if anyone was watching. Didn't stop to think about what happened last time she pulled a stunt like this. Nope. She just grabbed the fake charging cable and plugged it into her car. And then, whoosh, the garden hose kicked in with full force, spraying water everywhere. On her car, on her clothes, on her perfectly styled hair. She screamed loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood and jumped back like she'd been electrocuted. I couldn't help but laugh as I watched it all unfold on my phone screen. It was like watching karma in real time. A beautiful symphony of justice conducted by yours truly. Karen stood there for a moment, completely drenched and looking utterly defeated. Then she ripped the fake cable out of her car and threw it on the ground before storming back into her Tesla. But here's the best part. In her rush to escape, she accidentally backed into one of my trash cans and knocked it over before speeding off into the night. Now let me tell you, it took everything in me not to run outside and wave goodbye as she drove away. But I figured it was better to let her stew in her own embarrassment without adding fuel to the fire. The next morning, though, that's when things got really interesting. Karen's car was still sitting in her driveway across the street, but now it had a big wet spot on the hood where the water had sprayed all night long. And apparently, word had gotten around about what happened because several neighbors stopped by throughout the day to ask if I'd heard about Karen's little incident. Of course, I played dumb. What else could I do? "Oh no," I said innocently. "What happened?" By lunchtime, half the neighborhood knew about Karen's midnight misadventure with my malfunctioning charger. And while most people thought it was hilarious, because let's be honest, Karen wasn't laughing. She showed up at my door later that afternoon looking furious, and still slightly damp from the night before. "You think you're so clever," she said through gritted teeth. "But this isn't over." "Karen," I replied calmly, "you trespassed on my property again. What did you expect? A red carpet?" She glared at me for a moment before storming off without another word. And honestly, that silence was more satisfying than anything else she could have said. Let me tell you, if you thought Karen's midnight soaking was the end of her antics, you're sorely mistaken. This woman didn't just have a knack for entitlement. She had an uncanny ability to turn every situation into a circus. And after her failed attempt to shame me at the HOA meeting and her humiliating encounter with my garden hose trap, she decided to escalate things to a level that can only be described as Karen logic. It all started the morning after her soaking incident. I was enjoying my usual cup of coffee, scrolling through the news on my tablet, when there was a knock at the door. Now, I don't know about you, but I've developed a sixth sense for trouble over the years. And this knock? It had Karen written all over it. I opened the door, and there she was, standing on my porch with an envelope in hand and an expression that screamed, "I'm about to ruin your day." She didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Mark," she said, waving the envelope in front of me like it was some kind of legal grenade. "You've left me no choice but to take action." "Action?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "What kind of action are we talking about here?" She smirked and handed me the envelope. "You've been served." Now let me pause here for a moment to let that sink in. Karen, the same woman who trespassed on my property multiple times, tried to break into my garage with a crowbar, and got soaked by my garden hose trap, was suing me. For what, you ask? Emotional distress. That's right. According to Karen's lawsuit, my refusal to let her use my EV charger had caused her severe emotional trauma, and the garden hose incident had left her humiliated and unable to sleep. She even claimed that her car had suffered water damage because of my malicious actions. I couldn't help but laugh as I read through the paperwork. Emotional distress? Water damage? Lady, you brought this on yourself. But instead of letting it get under my skin, I decided to handle it the way any rational person would, with facts, logic, and just a hint of petty revenge. First things first, I called up my lawyer, a no-nonsense guy named Steve who's been handling cases like this for decades. When I explained the situation to him, he chuckled and said, "Mark, this is one of the most ridiculous lawsuits I've ever heard of. Don't worry, we'll take care of it." Steve helped me gather all the evidence I needed. Security footage showing Karen trespassing on my property multiple times, copies of the HOA's ruling affirming that my charger was private property, and even receipts for the garden hose and fake charging port, because why not? By the time we were done preparing for court, I felt like I could write a book titled How to Deal with Entitled Neighbors, a step-by-step guide. The day of the hearing arrived, and let me tell you, it was better than any courtroom drama you've ever seen on TV. Karen showed up dressed like she was auditioning for Legally Blonde, complete with a stack of papers that looked suspiciously like printouts from WebMD. When it was her turn to speak, she launched into a monologue about how my actions had destroyed her sense of community and made her feel unsafe in her own neighborhood. She even teared up at one point, though I'm pretty sure those tears were as fake as her lawsuit. But then it was my turn. And oh boy, did Steve and I come prepared. First, we presented the security footage showing Karen trespassing on my property. Not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. The judge raised an eyebrow as he watched her try to pry open my garage door with a crowbar. Next, we showed copies of the HOA's ruling affirming that my charger was private property and that Karen had violated community rules by attempting unauthorized access. The judge nodded in agreement. And finally, my personal favorite, we played the footage from the garden hose incident. As Karen's midnight soaking played out on screen for everyone in the courtroom to see, Steve leaned over and whispered, "I think we just won." By the time we finished presenting our case, Karen looked like she wanted to crawl under the nearest table and disappear. The judge didn't even need much time to deliberate. "Ms. Johnson," he said. "Yes, Karen finally has a last name. It's clear from the evidence presented that your actions were not only inappropriate but also illegal. This court finds in favor of Mr. Davis." Victory. Sweet, sweet victory. But wait, it gets better. Not only did Karen lose her lawsuit against me, but she also ended up owing me money for court fees and damages related to her attempted break-in. That's right, I got paid for dealing with her nonsense. After Karen's lawsuit crashed and burned in spectacular fashion, I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd finally learned her lesson. But as you've probably figured out by now, Karen isn't the kind of person who takes a loss gracefully. No, she's the kind of person who doubles down, even when she's clearly in the wrong. But this time, the universe, or maybe just karma, decided to step in and finish what I started. So let me set the scene for you. It's a sunny Saturday afternoon, and I'm out in my front yard doing some light yard work. You know, trimming hedges, pulling weeds, the kind of stuff that keeps you busy but doesn't require too much brain power. Across the street, Karen's house is unusually quiet. No Tesla in the driveway. No sign of her stomping around like she owns the neighborhood. For a brief moment, I think maybe she's finally moved on. But then I hear it, the unmistakable sound of screeching tires. I look up just in time to see Karen pulling into her driveway like a bat out of hell. And what's behind her? A tow truck. That's right, Karen's beloved Tesla is being repossessed. Now, I'm not one to revel in someone else's misfortune. Okay, who am I kidding? Watching that tow truck back into her driveway was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. It was like watching justice served on a silver platter. Karen storms out of her car and starts yelling at the tow truck driver. She's waving her arms around, pointing at her car like it's some kind of sacred artifact. But the driver isn't having any of it. He calmly hands her a clipboard and tells her that if she has an issue, she can take it up with the bank. At this point, I can't resist walking over to check on things. You know, just being a good neighbor. "Everything okay over here?" I ask innocently. Karen whirls around and glares at me like I'm personally responsible for her car being repossessed. "This is none of your business," she snaps. "Well," I say with a shrug. "It kind of is. You're blocking the street." She huffs and turns back to the tow truck driver, who is now loading her Tesla onto the flatbed. "You can't do this," she yells. "I need my car. How am I supposed to get anywhere?" The driver doesn't even look up from his clipboard. "Ma'am," he says flatly, "you're 3 months behind on payments. This car belongs to the bank now." 3 months behind? Suddenly, everything clicks into place. The reason Karen was so desperate to use my charger wasn't because she couldn't find another one. It was because she couldn't afford to pay for electricity at home or at public stations. All that entitlement and arrogance was just a cover for the fact that she was living way beyond her means. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not heartless. If Karen had come to me and explained her situation like a normal human being, I might have been willing to help her out. But instead, she chose to trespass on my property, vandalize my garage door, and sue me for emotional distress. So forgive me if I didn't feel particularly sympathetic as I watched her Tesla disappear down the street on the back of that tow truck. After the tow truck left, Karen stormed back into her house without another word. And you know what? That was the last time I ever saw her. A few weeks later, a for sale sign went up in front of her house. Rumor has it she moved back in with her parents somewhere out of state, probably to regroup and plan her next campaign of entitlement. As for me, well, Life has been pretty peaceful ever since Karen left. No more surprise visits from trespassers in my driveway. No more crowbars or fake lawsuits or ridiculous HOA meetings. Just quiet evenings with my coffee and my security cameras, which now serve more as entertainment than necessity. And you know what? This whole experience taught me something important. Sometimes you have to stand your ground against people who think they can walk all over you. Whether it's an entitled neighbor or anyone else who refuses to respect boundaries, there's nothing wrong with standing up for yourself, especially if you can do it with a little humor and creativity along the way. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever dealt with someone like Karen? Someone who thought they could rewrite reality to suit their own needs? If so, or even if not, I'd love to hear your stories. Drop them in the comments below because trust me, there's nothing better than sharing a good laugh over shared experiences. And hey, if you enjoyed this story or found it relatable, don't forget to like this post, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more tales of suburban drama and petty revenge. Thanks for sticking around till the end. You guys are the real MVPs.